Over the years, we've seen the rise and fall of many great gaming franchises, and the reason they fade into obscurity varies. There are franchises that died because nobody cared. Publishers pulled the plug, sales collapsed, and the audience moved on. But that's not this story. Jak and Daxter has one of the most devoted fan bases in PlayStation history. People who grew up with those games don't just remember them, they ache for them. Forums still active, fan petitions still circulating, community is still alive, still waiting 2 decades after the last real game came out. And here's the thing that makes this story genuinely strange. Nobody made a catastrophically wrong decision. The studio that built Jak became the most critically acclaimed developer in PlayStation history. The company that owns him protected the IP perfectly. No licensing disputes, no hostile takeovers, no corporate chaos, no villainous publishers. Everything went right. And somehow, in the middle of all that success, Jak and Daxter just kept getting left behind. Not abandoned by fans, not killed by greed, left behind by greatness, by bigger things. This is the story of how Naughty Dog built one of PlayStation's most beloved franchises, and then outgrew it. To understand why losing Jak hurts as much as it does, you first have to understand what made him extraordinary. Many gaming fans have had some interaction with Jak and Daxter over the years, but most people have no idea how close it came to never existing at all, or what it cost to make it real. Cast your mind back to 1999. Naughty Dog had just finished Crash Team Racing, their 4th Crash game in 4 years. 4 classics, 26 million copies sold, the most successful Western developer on the original PlayStation. But underneath that success, something was breaking. Crash Bandicoot didn't belong to them. He never had. Universal owned the IP, and the relationship had deteriorated to the point where Naughty Dog co-founder Jason Rubin later described it as, and I'm quoting directly here, a hostility that was just brutal. So they made a decision. Walk away from Crash, walk away from Universal, and build something new, on their own terms, for a partner they actually trusted. That partner was Sony, and the timing couldn't have been better. Sony wanted Naughty Dog exclusively, wanted to buy the studio outright so they could never make games for a competitor. For Naughty Dog, it was the right deal at the right moment. No more hostile licensing agreements, no more building something brilliant and watching someone else own it. Sony's one condition was simple: build us an IP that belongs to us, not licensed through a third party like Crash was, ours completely, so that never happens again. Naughty Dog agreed, and Sony bought the studio. And the most important consequence of that deal, the one that sometimes falls through the cracks of our memory, is that Jak and Daxter was a Sony IP from day one. No Universal, no hostile corporation waiting to take him when the contract expired. Sony owned him completely from the first moment he existed. On paper, that should have been the thing that saved him. Now, the game itself. While the rest of the team was finishing Crash Team Racing, 2 programmers quietly broke away to start building something new. They had one central ambition that everyone around them said was impossible for the hardware: a fully seamless 3D open world with 0 loading screens. Not reduced loading, not cleverly disguised loading, 0. They built a custom programming language from scratch to make it work. Game-oriented assembly Lisp, or GOL, and recruited animators from Disney and Nickelodeon to fill the world that they were creating. Art director Bob Raffi pointed to Star Wars, Disney, and Studio Ghibli as the key creative references. The result was a world unlike anything the PS2 had seen. When Jak and Daxter, the precursor legacy, launched in December 2001, it didn't just impress critics, it broke records. Guinness World Records confirmed it held the title of first seamless 3D world in a console game. Metacritic gave it a 90. It sold 2 million copies in the United States alone. But despite its success, almost nobody outside the PlayStation community remembers it due to it being a Sony-owned game. But here's a detail that tells you everything about the ambition behind the game. When Naughty Dog were casting voice actors, Jason Rubin offered Chris Rock $250,000 to voice Daxter. People forget how big of a star Chris Rock was in the early 2000s, and how much money $250,000 was in the early 2000s. But Chris Rock turned them down. George Carlin was approached for Samos the Sage. He also said no. They ended up casting Max Casella, a Sopranos actor, and Rubin later said they were lucky Rock turned them down. Daxter wouldn't have been the same character. Oh, and Jack himself? He doesn't say a single word in the entire first game, not one line. Naughty Dog made him a silent protagonist deliberately. They wanted the player to feel like they were Jack, to inhabit him completely. That decision would become one of the most shocking creative pivots in gaming history, because in the sequel, Jack speaks for the very first time, and his first words are not what anyone expected. It's 2001. The original Jak and Daxter is critically acclaimed, commercially successful, and widely considered one of the finest 3D platformers ever made. The future looks bright. But another game also launched that same year and completely changed the gaming landscape forever. Grand Theft Auto 3. Naughty Dog, by their own admission, didn't see it coming. GTA 3 hit the industry like a bomb, a dark, cinematic, open-world crime game that rewrote what people expected from a console experience. And in the words of one former developer, if you weren't making something like GTA in that moment, most publishers didn't think you were marketable. Naughty Dog looked at the landscape. They looked at their cheerful, colourful, E-rated platformer, and they made a decision that would divide their fanbase permanently. Jak 2 arrived in 2003, and from the opening seconds it was clear this was not the same game. Jak has been arrested, thrown into prison, experimented on with dark eco for 2 years by a corrupt dictator named Baron Praxis. When Daxter finally breaks him out of his cell, Daxter, the same wisecracking sidekick from the first game, pleads with Jak to say something, just this once, and Jak, who never spoke a single word across an entire game, opens his mouth.
I'm gonna kill Praxis!
That moment is one of the most audacious, creative statements any sequel has ever made. In 4 words, Naughty Dog told you everything had changed. The sunny platformer was gone. The silent hero was gone. In his place, a rage-filled young man with dark eco coursing through his veins, capable of transforming into a demon who'd spent 2 years being tortured and had murder on his mind. Some fans were electrified, others never forgave it. Evan Wells, the game's director, was clear about what they were doing. They wanted to expand the audience, reach older players, build something more cinematic, and they succeeded. Jak 2 was technically extraordinary, narratively bold, and mechanically ambitious. But something was also being lost. With each game, the series was declining in sales. Jak and Daxter sold 2 million in the US, Jak 2 sold less, and Jak 3, developed in just 13 months, sold less again. The fanbase was fragmenting between people who wanted the warmth of the original and people who embraced the darker direction. Jak 3 launched in November 2004 and was directly inspired by another Rockstar game, Smuggler's Run. Desert environments, buggy driving, a wasteland setting. Josh Scher, one of the writers, later confirmed Jason Rubin was playing it, and suddenly there was a lot of desert in Jak 3. Jak 3 was also quietly historic for another reason. It was the first Naughty Dog game to involve 2 people who would go on to shape the studio's entire future. Amy Hennig, who would write Uncharted, and Neil Druckmann, who would create The Last of Us. Both of them showed up at the end of Jak's story, not the beginning. And then came Jak X Combat Racing, a vehicular combat spin-off built quickly on Jak 3's existing assets. By the studio's own admission, it was designed to give the team breathing room between the PS2 era and whatever came next. Breathing room is a polite way of saying, we're done with this. We just don't know what's coming yet. And what was coming was something that would nearly destroy the studio before it made them immortal. In 2004, something significant happened at Naughty Dog that almost nobody outside the industry noticed at the time. Andy Gavin and Jason Rubin left. The 2 men who had built the studio from a bedroom operation, who had created Crash Bandicoot and Jak and Daxter, who had run Naughty Dog for 18 years, they walked out the door, quietly, deliberately, and handed the keys to a new generation of leadership. They didn't leave because of a scandal. They didn't leave because of a dispute. The deal they signed when Sony acquired the studio was structured for 4 years, and when those 4 years were up, they moved on. They built something extraordinary. Now it was someone else's turn. What came next by the account of the people who lived through it, were the darkest years in Naughty Dog's history. The PlayStation 3 was arriving, and the PS3 was genuinely unlike anything developers had encountered. Its architecture was extraordinarily complex, a cell processor that required an entirely new approach to programming. Naughty Dog had to build their entire codebase from scratch. Every tool they'd developed across Crash and Jak, gone. Start again. The people who took over from Gavin and Ruben, Evan Wells, Christoph Balestra, Bruce Straley, later documented what happened in the art of Naughty Dog, and the picture they painted is striking. Their exact words? Dozens of new proposals thrown out, months and months of tool work completely scrapped, and for 3 or 4 months straight, no fewer than one employee quitting every week, as they lost hope we'd pull out of our slump. Every week, for months, people walking out the door because they genuinely didn't believe the studio was going to survive the transition. And it was during this period, this desperate, chaotic scramble to find solid ground, that Jak and Daxter was first sacrificed. Because buried inside those dozens of scrapped proposals was a Jak and Daxter reboot. The team explored reinventing the franchise as a linear storytelling experience, a more cinematic Jak, built for PS3 hardware. It was one of many directions they considered, and then something clicked. The ideas that didn't fit Jak, the realistic human characters, the grounded world, the cinematic narrative, those ideas kept pulling in a different direction, away from the fantasy worlds and towards something more real, something they didn't have a name for yet. They called the project Big, and Big became Uncharted: Drake's Fortune. Released in 2007, the debut of Nathan Drake, the beginning of a franchise that would go on to sell over 40 million copies and become one of PlayStation's most celebrated series of all time. As for Jak, well, he was handed a PSP spin-off instead, The Lost Frontier. Developed by High Impact Games, a studio formed by former Insomniac and Naughty Dog members. They weren't an unknown studio. They'd made well-received Ratchet and Clank handheld games. But The Last Frontier scored a 71 on Metacritic, the lowest in franchise history. A Naughty Dog employee later said directly, "I'm not happy with that being Jak's swan song. I think we could have done a lot better." That was 2009, and it should have been the end of the story, except Naughty Dog came back to Jak. Not once, not twice, 3 times. Here's what makes the Jak and Daxter story genuinely painful. It wasn't one abandonment, it was 3. Each one more considered than the last, but each one ending the same way. The first you already know. 2006, the PS3 transition, Jak concepts become Uncharted. The studio moved forward, Jak got a PSP game made by someone else. The second came after Uncharted 2. Naughty Dog split into 2 teams, one making Uncharted 3, the other given to Neil Druckmann and Bruce Straley to lead. Their brief was simple: make the next Jak and Daxter. They started down that road, and the further they went, the more they realized they were making something that didn't honor what Jak actually was. In their own words, they weren't doing service to the fans of the franchise, so they stopped and built something else entirely. The Last of Us, a post-apocalyptic survival story about a smuggler and a teenage girl in a world destroyed by a fungal infection. Dark, human, unlike anything Naughty Dog had ever made. The Last of Us went on to receive hundreds of Game of the Year awards. It became a cultural phenomenon, a HBO series, a sequel, a franchise, but Jak? He got nothing. Now the third attempt is the one that cuts the deepest. Between 2010 and 2011, Naughty Dog made one more serious run at a Jak reboot. This time they commissioned concept art from Scribblepad Studios. Detailed, ambitious, fully realized visualizations of what a PS3 Jak and Daxter could look like. A more realistic Jak, grittier environments, a harder world. And as the work developed, the team ran into a question they couldn't answer. In their own words, there were already so many firmly established relationships, character personalities, and character motivations. It became tougher to feel engaged by the prospect of making a new Jak and Daxter. The dilemma they described was this: if we stuck to the constraints of the already established world, would we be happy with the type of game we were about to make? If we diverged too greatly from those constraints, were we actually making Jak and Daxter anymore? They couldn't answer it, so they walked away. Again, The concept art was never meant to be seen publicly, but it leaked in 2014. And when fans finally got a look at what a Jak 4 might have been, a hyper-realistic, gritty reimagining completely unlike the games they'd grown up with, many of them understood immediately why Naughty Dog had walked away. It wasn't Jak. Not really. It was Naughty Dog trying to make a Jak game, realizing they'd became a different studio, and being honest enough to stop, which brings us to where we are now. Because the story doesn't end with abandoned concept art. It ends with something far stranger. In December 2024, Naughty Dog took the stage at the Game Awards and revealed their next project, a brand new IP, a sci-fi action game called Intergalactic: The Heretic Prophet. And within hours, the Jak and Daxter community noticed something. The giant robot at the end of the reveal trailer, the formidable mechanical enemy looming over the protagonist, bore a striking visual resemblance to robots in the cancelled Jak 4 concept art. Side by side, the silhouettes are almost identical. Now, whether that's intentional recycling of old ideas or pure coincidence, nobody at Naughty Dog has confirmed, but it tells you something about where Jak ends up in the end. Not as a game, as a ghost, haunting the edges of every new thing Naughty Dog builds, never quite materializing into something real. And here's what makes that harder to accept. Sony owns Jak and Daxter. There is no licensing dispute to resolve, no hostile corporation to negotiate with. The IP is sitting in Sony's library, perfectly preserved, waiting. Sony could greenlight a Jak game tomorrow. They have the asset, they have the audience, they have the technology. What they apparently don't have is the will. In 2019, a team at Sanzeril Games, the studio behind Sly Cooper, Thieves in Time, assembled quietly and built a pitch for a Jak and Daxter remaster. They recreated the opening cutscene of the original game shot for shot in modern graphics to show Sony exactly what it could look like. They presented it, Sony passed. Sanzeril Games was shut down in January 2026. The footage of that pitch surfaced publicly just months later, and watching it, you can see exactly what fans had been asking for: a loving, faithful reimagining that understood what made the original special. But Sony said no. Bluepoint Games, the studio behind the critically acclaimed Demon's Souls remake and Shadow of the Colossus, reportedly also pitched a Jak and Daxter remake at some point. Bluepoint was shut down by Sony in 2025. Two studios, both passionate about Jak, both making the case that the audience is there, both gone. Meanwhile, Jak and Daxter, the precursor legacy, was added to PlayStation Plus Premium in late 2024, updated with modern emulation features like save states and rewind, which is something. Sony knows the game exists, they're maintaining it, they're just not building on it. And when you look at what Sony has on its plate, Naughty Dog deep in Intergalactic and The Last of Us Part 3, the studio's bandwidth completely consumed, the honest answer is that Jak isn't being actively rejected. He's just not the priority. He's never the priority. He's PlayStation's most beloved waiting room franchise. The IP that everyone agrees deserves better, and nobody quite gets around to giving it. The fans though? The fans never left. When I asked my audience what franchise they wanted me to cover next, given a list that included Ratchet and Clank, COD Zombies and others, the overwhelming majority voted for Jak and Daxter. Not a current franchise, not something with a new game on the horizon, a series that last released a game when most of my audience were in primary school. That's not just nostalgia, that's something deeper. That's the feeling of something unfinished, something that deserved a proper ending and never got one. Jak and Daxter wasn't abandoned because it failed. It was abandoned because everything around it succeeded. Every time Naughty Dog stood at a crossroads, Jak or something new, they chose something new. And every time, that choice turned out to be right. Uncharted was right, The Last of Us was right, and maybe Intergalactic will be right too. But being right doesn't make the loss hurt any less. Sony still owns him, the audience is still there, and somewhere in PlayStation's library, Jak and Daxter sits quietly, perfectly protected, perfectly preserved, still waiting for someone to finally say yes. So I want to ask you something. Do you think Sony will ever say yes? Is there a version of the future where Jak and Daxter get the revival they deserve? A real one, made by people who actually understand what it is? Or has Naughty Dog moved too far, become too different a studio for that connection to ever be rebuilt? But here's the thing, the spark is still alive. I know it is. The fans didn't abandon Jak. They never did. But drop your answer below because I genuinely want to know where you stand. And if this kind of deep dive into the stories behind the games you grew up with is what you're here for, you already know what to do. I'm Dan Squidz. This is the home of retro, classic, and nostalgia gaming. Thank you so much for watching to the end. I'll see you in the next one.